Hey everyone, welcome to Creeps. My name is Lindsey and I'm a reference librarian at Radnor Memorial Library as well as the resident true crime nerd. We've hit spring. I hope everyone is doing well and taking a lot of Benadryl and Claritin, quite like myself, for the impending allergy season. On today's episode, we are going to visit Florida, a state well known for being Florida, a state that has anywhere between 596 to 1,100 murders a year, depending on which statistics you're looking at, a state that has a rough estimate of 3.5 serial killers per 100,000 people, and a state that gave us Casey Anthony, the Daytona Beach Killer, a fried Ted Bundy, and of course, everyone's favorite, Florida Man. In 1990, a series of killings over the span of only 4 days rocked the University of Florida's campus. 4 students and a local community college student were brutally murdered by what would become known as the Gainesville Ripper, and what would eventually spawn a movie franchise, which I will let you know about at the end of this episode. So let's begin. Starting with our cast of characters, we have the Grissom family from Shreveport, Louisiana, a year before the Gainesville murders. William Grissom, age 55, his daughter Julie, age 24, and his grandson and Julie's nephew Sean, age 8. Then we have the Gainesville victims: Sonia Larson, Christina Powell, Krista Hoyt, Manny Taboada, and Tracy Pauls. And our 2 suspects, Danny Rawling and Edward Humphrey. So our timeline is actually going to begin before the Gainesville killings, like I said, in Shreveport, Louisiana in 1989. So November 6th, 8-year-old Sean had been visiting his grandfather for his birthday weekend, along with his Aunt Julie. He was supposed to be returning the morning of the 6th, but when his mom found the house, there's no response. So in a panic, she calls the police. They show up to the house, walk directly into a bloody mess. William was slumped against the back door, blocking the utility room. He'd been stabbed multiple times in the front and the back, and there was evidence he'd actually been in the middle of cooking steaks on the grill when this happened. Sean was found next in the living room. He only had 1 fatal stab wound, and he'd been watching TV. And then they found Julie. She had borne the brunt of most of the attack. She'd been stabbed 3 times. She hung naked off the end of the bed, face up. She'd been cleaned up with vinegar and then posed. So keep in mind that cleaning up the bodies is actually something that will be a theme in this episode. All 3 of them were also thought to have been killed between 6 to 8 p.m. 2 days before. There were no signs of forced entry. The scene had been cleaned, and the neighborhood immediately goes into lockdown. So a year goes by without any answers in the Grissom murders, and our timeline actually moves over to Florida at this point, to August 24th through the 27th, 1990. So in Gainesville, Sonia Larson, age 18, and Krista Powell, age 17, were both freshmen at the University of Florida and were living off campus. They both kept in frequent contact with their parents, which is what alerted them to something being wrong with the girls. When neither of the girls answered the phone and no one came to the door when the parents visited, the Powells called the police. Another horrifying scene met them when they all walked in. Sonia Larson was found in her bed, stabbed, mutilated, raped, and posed. Yeah, she was found with her arms over her head, halfway off the bed, very similar to Julie Grissom. Christina Powell was found posed, naked, raped, stabbed, and mutilated in the hallway, of the apartment near the front door. Her underwear as well as body parts were missing. And like the Grissoms, they had been killed 2 days before they had been found. And like Julie Grissom, both have been cleaned, and this time with dish soap in an effort to get rid of the rape evidence. Yeah. Following day, when the night records clerk for the county sheriff's office didn't show up for her shift at midnight as scheduled, someone called to check in on Krista Hoyt. When the police arrived, they found her car still in the driveway and the sliding glass door at the back of the apartment locked. According to the articles about this, there was a bamboo curtain that hung down, leaving about a foot of space at the bottom of the window. So the cops bent down to see if there was anything that, they could find. What they saw was a pair of feet still in shoes and socks planted on the floor near the bed. Feeling that something seemed a little off, they break into the house, finding what might be the most gruesome of the murders in this series. So that's a warning right now. Krista Hoyt was bent at the waist at the end of the bed. She was naked, save for the shoes and socks. She'd been gutted from the neck down, and her chest had been mutilated. Again, underwear was missing, but this time the body parts were there. They'd been cut off, but they were there near her. And that's actually still not the worst thing about this crime scene. When the police finally entered the room, they were greeted by Krista Hoyt's head, which had been placed on a bookshelf next to the bed, facing the door and staring directly at whoever would walk in. Yeah. So again, like mentioned, underwear missing, cleaned up with dish soap. So what else was interesting about this part is that she was found murdered the same day that Powell and Larson were found, and her apartment was only 2 miles from theirs. Which brings us to August 27th. A friend of Manny Tabawada and Tracy Pauls had been trying to get a hold of them for some time. Now, Manny was a pretty formidable dude. He was a football player weighing in like clearly over 200 pounds, above 6 foot, and Tracy had asked him to move in, or was the other way around? I'm not entirely sure, because it made her and her parents feel safer that she was roommates with a guy who could easily take somebody out. So while there wasn't a ton of worry, the friends still wanted to check on them. And after failing to get any kind of answer, they called the building manager. When the manager unlocked the door, he looked in for all of a few seconds before just slamming it shut and then told them to call the police. So in the hallway in front of the door was Tracy. She had been posed with a towel under her hips, more than likely to keep her body upright. Her hair was wet, and she'd been cleaned. However, there was no sign of any kind of mutilation. Interestingly enough, when the manager opened the door, he'd said she'd been laying flat and that there was a black bag next to her. Well, when the door was opened by police, this time it was unlocked and the bag was missing. They probably had interrupted the Gainesville Ripper. Moving through the apartment, they found Manny. He'd been killed in bed and had massive amounts of defensive wounds on his arms, which means the guy didn't go down with a fight, and apparently neither did Tracy. Her bedroom door was broken down, and there were signs of struggle everywhere. More than likely, Manny had been taken out first. Tracy had either seen or heard him and then ran to her bedroom and locked the door. Once the killer had knocked the door down, that was probably the end of it for her. Now, okay, so there's a lot going on here in such a short span of time, and the police are kind of at a loss. So what do? They hone in almost immediately on a guy they think is the killer, and as we've learned in past episodes, this is usually never the case. Edward Humphrey was a guy with a rap sheet, sure, a history of mental instability, sure, and had lived in one of the apartment buildings of a victim, sure. So the guy looks good. They bring him in. Then on August 28th, a man who had set up a campsite near the campus was involved with a friend in a bank robbery. When the police checked his campsite, the only thing they were interested in was the dyed money bag. You know, not the trophies from the victims or the bloody clothing or the K-bar knife that was used in definitely 1 or 2 of the murders, you know. Anyway, this guy gets off the hook, and it takes a month before they catch him. On September 8th, a robbery at a Winn-Dixie supermarket in Ocala, Florida, alerts police. By the time they show up, the guy's gone in a stolen car. However, good news, a manager had gotten into his own car and followed this guy as far as he could go, letting police know where this guy was headed. Shortly after, the suspect actually crashed his car, got out on foot, and ran into an office building where he evaded cops very briefly. And then, Danny Rawling is arrested as he tries to escape out the back door of the office building. The Gainesville Ripper had finally been caught. So who was this guy? Well, he wasn't Edward Humphrey, that's for sure. Danny Rawling was a guy who was born in 1954 to a seriously abusive ex-military and cop father and a mother who was terrified of the guy. Throughout his life, Danny and his brother suffered incredible amounts of abuse, including weekly whippings and beatings, just among other things. He was in and out of school, for months at a time sometimes, and eventually the inevitable happened. He became a delinquent. So he was unable to actually acclimate to society, and he worked odd jobs. He moved around, ending up in Kansas, Florida, Georgia, finally back in Shreveport, where he got a job as a waiter. So not much is known about him from, aside from this, but Peter Vronsky, the author, true crime author, gets more into detail about him in American Serial Killers, The Epidemic Years. Big plug here, highly recommend this book. Now, all of this culminates in what would eventually lead to Danny's killing spree. In 1989, he murdered the Grissom family, and then an altercation with his father in May of 1990 would spark what eventually would happen in August. His father lost an ear and an eye to a gunshot from his own son. Now, I don't condone the murders or see any of his upbringing as an excuse for being a serial killer, but I think we can all agree maybe his dad kind of had it coming a little bit. Just saying. After his arrest, Danny was sentenced to death via lethal injection. Now, this didn't happen until 2006. He even had time to get married and do multiple interviews about his whole crime spree. He claimed it was a previously undisclosed alter ego that made him do it, or it was the abuse, or the sexual assaults he suffered in prison, which we're not sure if they actually did or not, so we don't know. Anyway, he was linked back to the Grissom murders in 1996 through DNA and completely sealed his fate on death row there. And while he was on the table, about to die, he starts singing a Christian song and was then pronounced dead at 6:13 p.m. So after all of that, Danny Rawling did leave some kind of legacy behind, whether or not he wanted to. Well, whether or not we wanted him to, really. Some interesting facts. The Gainesville Ripper was Kevin Williamson's inspiration for the movie Scream in 1996, spawning a series of popular movies. And the first horror movie I ever saw at the age of 11, when I was definitely probably too young to see it. His last meal was lobster tail, shrimp, baked potato, strawberry cheesecake, and sweet tea. And he got married to Sandra London in prison and helped her co-author a book about his crimes with that. So there's that. And as I always like to do, I like to wrap up some things. I like to wrap up things with some recommendations. One book, one podcast, one documentary. For the book, again, I cannot recommend Peter Vronsky's American Serial Killers enough. It's thorough, and it covers almost literally everybody from 1920 to 1990. It's insane. Anything Vronsky writes is definitely worth a read, but if you'd like to read a firsthand account from the killer himself, The Making of a Serial Killer, The True Story of the Gainesville Ripper by London and Rawling is available. One documentary, while there isn't anything specific to Rawling, he has been the feature of several true crime shows, including Cold Blooded, Forensic Factor, Nightmare Next Door, and Mark of the Killer, and actually airing this week. 2020 is doing a special on him. Finally, one podcast. The Serial Killer Podcast has a several-part series on Danny Rawling and definitely worth a listen. So, signing off, I hope everyone is enjoying the spring weather, staying safe, taking precautions and care of themselves, and I hope to see everyone at the library. Take care. Bye. I've got a serious hot mess in my hair right now.